The law office smelled like old leather and broken dreams. I sat in the stiff chair, my hands folded in my lap, still wearing the black dress from Bob's funeral 3 days earlier. The fabric felt heavy against my skin, weighted down by grief and the oppressive silence that had settled over our family since we'd lowered my husband into the ground. Across from me, my son Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes fixed on anything but my face. Beside him, his wife Brittany examined her perfectly manicured nails with theatrical boredom, occasionally sighing loud enough to fill the room with her impatience. At 32, she had the kind of polished beauty that came from expensive salons and designer clothes, but there was something cold in her green eyes that had always made me uneasy. Mr. Henderson, our family lawyer for the past 15 years, cleared his throat and began reading Bob's will in that monotone voice lawyers seem to perfect in school. His words felt distant, like they were coming from underwater as he outlined the division of our life together. To my beloved wife, Dorothy Williams, I leave the ranch property on Willow Creek Road, including all buildings, land, and mineral rights thereto. Before he could finish the sentence, Brittany let out an exaggerated sigh that cut through the room like a knife. "Oh, for crying out loud," she said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Just get rid of that old dump. Dorothy, come live with us. You can help with the kids and actually be useful for once." The words hit me like a physical blow. Useful for once. As if 42 years of marriage, of raising Jake as a single mother, while Bob struggled to find steady work, of sacrificing my nursing career to keep our family afloat, had been nothing but wasted time. My chest tightened as I looked at Jake, waiting for him to defend me, to say something, anything, that would acknowledge I was his mother and deserved basic respect. But he just stared at his hands, those same hands I'd held when he had nightmares, that I'd bandaged when he fell off his bike, that I'd taught to tie his shoes and write his name. This was my son, the boy I'd worked double shifts at the diner to support, who I'd driven to every soccer practice and school play, who I'd celebrated with during every small victory and comforted through every disappointment. Now, he couldn't even look at me. Mr. Henderson continued reading, his voice growing quieter as if he sensed the tension building in the room. The main residence on Maple Street, along with all investment accounts and remaining liquid assets, are to be divided equally between my son Jake Williams and his wife Brittany Williams. Finally, Brittany interrupted again, sitting up straighter with renewed interest. Something worth talking about. I watched in numb silence as they discussed my life, like I wasn't even there. The house where I'd lived for 37 years, where I'd raised Jake, where I'd nursed Bob through his final illness, it was all being carved up and distributed like pieces of a pie. The irony wasn't lost on me that Bob had given me the property everyone considered worthless while leaving the valuable assets to the daughter-in-law who'd spent the last 5 years systematically poisoning my son against me. Brittany had grown up poor in a trailer park outside town, something she'd confided in me during the early days of her relationship with Jake when she was still pretending to like me. Back then, she'd seemed grateful for my acceptance, even calling me Mom Williams, with what I'd thought was genuine affection. But success had changed her. As Jake's accounting practice grew and their lifestyle improved, Brittany had begun to see my modest background and simple ways as embarrassments to be hidden. The gifts I brought my grandchildren became inappropriate. The advice I offered was outdated. The traditions I wanted to share were too old-fashioned. Slowly, but systematically, she'd erased me from their lives while Jake stood by and let it happen. When the reading finished, Brittany stood up and smoothed her designer skirt with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a long-fought war. "Well, Dorothy," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I guess that settles it. Just get out of our lives and keep that old ranch. Maybe the isolation will give you time to think about all the ways you failed as a mother. The words landed like hammer blows. Failed as a mother. I'd sacrificed everything for Jake. My career, my dreams, my identity. I'd worked nights at the diner while he slept, saved every penny for his college fund, celebrated every small victory, and mourned every disappointment as if they were my own. And this was what I got in return. Jake finally looked up then, but instead of defending me, he said quietly, "Maybe it's for the best. Mom, you and Brittany have never really gotten along. A fresh start might be good for everyone." Never gotten along. As if this was some petty disagreement between women instead of a systematic campaign to erase me from my own family's life. As if I hadn't spent years trying to build a relationship with a woman who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to her perfect suburban life. "I understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I gathered my purse and stood on unsteady legs, feeling every one of my 69 years. "I'll pack my things." Brittany's smile was triumphant, the look of someone who'd finally gotten rid of a persistent problem. "Don't forget to take all those old photos and knickknacks. We're redecorating anyway." Old photos and knickknacks. 40 years of memories reduced to clutter in her eyes. The wedding pictures, Jake's baby photos, family Christmas mornings, all of it dismissed as junk she couldn't wait to throw away. The drive home to pack my belongings was a blur of tears and disbelief. The house that had been my sanctuary for nearly 4 decades suddenly felt foreign, like I was a trespasser in my own life. Every room held memories that now felt tainted by the knowledge that I was no longer welcome in the family I'd helped create. Jake didn't offer to help me pack. He didn't even call to check on me. The silence from my son was perhaps more devastating than Brittany's cruel words. At least her hatred was honest. Jake's indifference felt like a betrayal that cut straight to my soul. I moved through the rooms mechanically, wrapping china that had been wedding gifts, folding clothes that smelled like the lavender sachets I'd made myself, packing books I'd read to Jake when he was small. Each item felt like another piece of my identity being boxed away, labeled, and marked for exile. The house felt different as I worked, as if it knew I was leaving. The floorboards that had creaked under Jake's running feet as a child now groaned under the weight of my solitude. The walls that had echoed with family dinners and birthday celebrations now seemed to absorb the sound of my footsteps, muffling them into insignificance. As I packed, memories flooded back with painful clarity. Working 3 jobs to pay for Jake's college while Bob struggled with unemployment. Taking night shifts at the hospital so I could attend Jake's high school graduation during the day. Saving for months to buy him his first car. A used Honda that I'd researched for weeks to make sure it was safe and reliable. I'd been a good mother. I knew that with absolute certainty, even as Brittany's words echoed in my mind. I'd made mistakes, as all parents do, but I'd loved Jake with everything I had. I'd put his needs before my own so consistently that I'd almost forgotten what my own needs were. The irony was bitter. In trying to give Jake everything I'd never had, I'd raised a man who could stand by and watch while his wife humiliated the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him. Maybe I had failed as a mother, but not in the way Brittany meant. Maybe I'd failed by teaching Jake that love meant accepting whatever treatment people chose to give you. When I finished packing, I loaded my car with 40 years of life reduced to boxes and garbage bags. The sedan sat low on its springs, weighed down with the physical remnants of a woman who was being erased as efficiently as dust wiped from a shelf. As I pulled away from the house for the last time, I saw Brittany watching from the front window, her expression satisfied and cold. She'd gotten what she wanted, complete control over Jake and the grandchildren I'd hoped to help raise. In her mind, the inconvenient mother-in-law had been successfully eliminated from the picture. The ranch was 40 miles outside town, down a dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. As I bumped along in my overloaded sedan, I wondered if this was how exile always felt, like driving toward the edge of the world while everything familiar disappeared in your rearview mirror. I'd only been to the ranch a handful of times over the years. Bob had inherited it from his grandfather Tom, but never seemed interested in doing anything with it. "Too much work," he'd always said when I suggested we fix it up or sell it. "Too many memories." I never understood what he meant by that last part until now, driving toward my new reality with nowhere else to go. The sun was setting as I pulled up to the weathered farmhouse, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. The building looked even more run down than I remembered: peeling white paint, sagging front porch, windows dark and unwelcoming. This ramshackle structure was home now, not by choice, but by the cruel mathematics of family politics. The key was where Bob had always kept it, under the loose board on the porch steps. My hands shook as I retrieved it, partly from exhaustion and partly from the surreal nature of my situation. 48 hours ago, I'd been Dorothy Williams, wife and mother. Now I was just Dorothy, the inconvenient woman who'd been shuffled off to a place where she couldn't interfere with other people's plans. Inside, the house smelled musty and forgotten. Dust motes danced in the fading light streaming through dirty windows, and every footstep echoed in the emptiness. The furniture was covered in white sheets like ghosts, and the air held the weight of years of neglect. I sat down heavily in what had once been the living room and finally allowed myself to cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears I'd shed at the funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of profound loss. I wasn't just mourning Bob anymore. I was mourning the illusion that family meant something more than convenience and inheritance. The silence around me was complete, broken only by the settling of old wood and the distant sound of wind through broken shutters. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly alone. No one needed me. No one was coming to check on me. No one cared whether I lived or died in this forgotten place. But as I sat there, surrounded by shadows and silence, something unexpected began to stir in my chest. Anger, not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, calculating anger of someone who'd finally understood how thoroughly they'd been used and discarded. I made a promise to myself in that moment, surrounded by the ghosts of a house I'd never wanted. I would survive this. I would find a way to rebuild my life from the ashes of what Jake and Brittany had left me. I just had no idea that the means to do exactly that was already waiting for me, hidden in the very foundations of the place they'd exiled me to. My phone buzzed once with a text from an unknown number, probably spam or a wrong number. I ignored it, too exhausted to care about anything beyond making it through the first night of my new life. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight I would grieve for the family I'd lost and the woman I used to be. The transformation had already begun. I just didn't know it yet. The first week at the ranch nearly broke me. Every morning I woke up expecting to hear Bob's coffee pot gurgling in the kitchen or Jake calling to complain about some crisis in his perfect suburban life. Instead, I was greeted by silence so complete it felt like the world had forgotten I existed. The only sounds were the settling of old wood, the occasional creak of the windmill outside my bedroom window, and the scurrying of small creatures in the walls. At night, the darkness was absolute in a way that city dwellers never experience. No streetlights, no traffic, no signs of human life beyond the glow of my single lamp. I threw myself into cleaning, partly because the house desperately needed it, and partly because keeping busy was the only thing standing between me and complete despair. Room by room, I pulled away dust covers and scrubbed away years of neglect. It was therapeutic in a way, like I was uncovering not just furniture, but pieces of Bob's past I'd never known existed. In the bedroom that had obviously been Bob's as a child, I found a collection of arrowheads carefully displayed in a glass case. Each one was labeled with a location and date, evidence of a hobby I'd never known he'd had. In 42 years of marriage,
Bob had never mentioned being interested in Native American artifacts beyond the occasional comment about finding old stuff when he was young. The room that must have been his grandfather Tom's study yielded even more surprises. The shelves were lined with geology books and rock samples, each one tagged with careful handwriting that documented where and when it had been found. Again, this was news to me. In all our years together, Bob had never mentioned rocks or minerals beyond complaining about the ones that turned up in our garden. But it was the kitchen that yielded the biggest surprise of all. While cleaning out the pantry, I noticed that one of the boards in the back wall seemed loose. When I pried it away, I discovered a metal box that had been carefully hidden behind it, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and time. My hands trembled as I carried the metal box to the kitchen table. It was heavier than I had expected, and the lock had long since rusted away. Inside, wrapped in layers of canvas that crumbled at my touch, I found a collection of letters tied with a faded red ribbon. The paper was yellowed with age, and the ink had faded to a soft brown. But the words were still readable. They were love letters, but not the kind I'd expected to find in Bob's family home. These were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, dated from the 1940s, and signed with the name Maria. At the bottom of the box were photographs that made my breath catch. A beautiful young woman with dark hair and expressive eyes stood next to a man who looked remarkably like what Bob might have looked like in his 20s. But the dates were all wrong. These photos were from decades before Bob was born. I sat at the kitchen table studying the photos and trying to piece together this hidden story. The man in the pictures had to be Bob's grandfather Tom, which meant the woman was Maria Santos, the mysterious woman whose letters spoke of passion and secrets in equal measure. As I read through the letters, my Spanish rusty from high school, but good enough to catch the meaning, a pattern began to emerge. Maria wasn't just writing about love. She was writing about business. She mentioned mining rights and land surveys and the wealth beneath the earth in ways that made my heart race with possibility. One letter in particular caught my attention. In it, Maria wrote about our secret and how Tom's surveys had confirmed what the old Apache had told him about the land. She mentioned copper and silver in the same breath as declarations of undying love, as if mineral wealth and romantic passion were somehow intertwined. That evening, I called the only person I could think of who might have answers. Helen Foster had lived in town longer than anyone and remembered Bob's family from the old days. Unlike some of the other women in town who'd started treating me differently after Brittany arrived and began spreading her poison, Helen had always been kind to me. "Oh, honey," Helen said when I explained what I'd found, her voice warm with sympathy and something that might have been excitement. "I was wondering when someone would finally ask about old Tom Williams mining claims." My heart stopped. Mining claims. Tom was always convinced there was copper on that property, maybe silver too. He spent years filing claims and doing surveys. But then the war came and he went off to fight. When he came back, he married that Mexican girl, Maria, I think her name was. Caused quite a scandal at the time, her being foreign and Catholic and all. Maria, the woman in the photographs, whose letters had spoken of secrets and wealth hidden in the earth. "What happened to her?" I asked, though something in Helen's tone already suggested the answer wouldn't be happy. "She died in childbirth," Helen said sadly. "Tom never really recovered. He kept working the land, convinced he'd strike it rich someday. But he became something of a hermit. When he died, he left everything to Bob's father, but by then everyone had forgotten about the mining business. Just figured it was the ramblings of a lonely old man." After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of the ranch house kitchen, my mind spinning with possibilities. Mining claims, surveys, land that might contain valuable minerals. No wonder Bob had always seemed reluctant to sell the ranch, even when we needed money. But why hadn't he ever told me why keep it secret? I spent the rest of the evening reading through Maria's letters more carefully, using an online translator to help with the more complex Spanish passages. The picture that emerged was of a woman deeply in love with a man who believed he'd found treasure in the New Mexico soil. Her letters spoke of surveys and assays, of companies interested in buying mining rights, of a future that would make them wealthy beyond their dreams. But Maria had died before any of those dreams came true, and Tom had apparently taken his secrets to the grave. The question was, what had he known, and what had he passed down to his family the next few days? I searched the house more systematically, no longer just cleaning, but actively looking for clues about Tom's mining activities. In his desk, I found survey maps dated from the 1940s, marked with notations I couldn't understand. There were correspondence files with the Bureau of Land Management and copies of mineral rights applications that had apparently been approved decades ago. Most intriguingly, there was a folder labeled Assay Reports that contained geological surveys suggesting the presence of copper deposits across significant portions of the property. The technical language was challenging, but the conclusions seemed promising. Multiple reports confirmed that there were commercially viable mineral deposits beneath the ranch. But it was what I found in Bob's grandfather's bedroom closet that really changed everything. Hidden behind a false back panel, wrapped in oilcloth, just like the letters, was a manila envelope containing documents that were much more recent than anything I'd found so far. These weren't Tom's surveys from the 1940s. These were updated geological assessments from the 1970s, and they painted a picture of substantial mineral wealth beneath the ranch. My hand shook as I read through technical language that spoke of economically viable extraction and estimated reserves in terms that suggested real money. But the most shocking discovery was a folder containing correspondence that was dated much more recently. There were notes in Bob's familiar handwriting in the margins, calculations and phone numbers that suggested he'd been researching this topic actively. Evidence that my husband had been investigating the mining potential of our land for years without ever mentioning it to me. The most devastating document was at the bottom of the pile, a letter from Southwestern Mining Corporation dated just 6 months before Bob's death, offering to lease the mineral rights for an amount that made my eyes water. The proposed upfront payment alone was more than Bob and I had earned in 10 years combined. Bob had never responded to the letter. According to the dates on the documents, he'd received this life-changing offer and simply set it aside without ever telling me it existed. I sat on the bedroom floor, surrounded by papers that painted a picture of wealth beyond anything I'd ever imagined, and tried to understand why my husband had kept this secret. At the very bottom of the envelope, I found a handwritten note in Bob's careful script. It was dated just weeks before his final hospital stay, when we both knew his condition was terminal. Dorothy deserves better than what I gave her. The note read, "This is her chance to have the life she sacrificed for Jake and me. Don't let that woman ruin everything we worked for." That woman. Even in his private notes. Bob couldn't bring himself to write Brittany's name, but his meaning was crystal clear. He'd known exactly what kind of person his daughter-in-law was, and he'd been protecting this discovery from her. The ranch that Jake and Brittany had dismissed as worthless, that they'd used to exile me from the family, was potentially worth more than everything else in Bob's estate combined. They'd essentially handed me millions of dollars while congratulating themselves on getting rid of me. I climbed the stairs from the basement with my mind racing and my heart pounding. In the kitchen, I spread the documents across the table and tried to think clearly about what to do next. The smart thing would be to contact Southwestern Mining Corporation immediately, confirm their offer was still valid, and start the process of leasing the mineral rights. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of Brittany's smug smile as she dismissed me from my own family. Maybe it was the way Jake had sat there silent while his wife humiliated me. Or maybe it was just the realization that for the first time in my adult life, I held all the cards. I thought about the phone calls I'd been ignoring all week. Jake had left several voicemails that I'd deleted without listening to. Brittany had sent text messages that I'd blocked. They probably expected me to come crawling back, begging for forgiveness and a place in their perfect suburban life. Instead, I picked up my phone and called the number on the Southwestern Mining letterhead. A professional woman's voice answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Williams, we'd been hoping to hear from you. Is this regarding your husband's mineral rights inquiry?" I took a deep breath, feeling power flow through me like electricity. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "I'd like to discuss your proposal." "Wonderful. We're still very interested in the property. In fact, given recent market conditions for copper, we might be able to improve on our original offer significantly. Could we arrange a site visit?" As I scheduled the appointment for the following week, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at me wasn't the broken, grieving widow who'd been exiled from her own family. This was someone else entirely. Someone with options. Someone with power. Someone who was about to change the rules of the game completely. I spent the rest of the day researching mining law and royalty agreements online. By evening, I understood exactly what I was sitting on and what it could mean for my future. More importantly, I understood what Jake and Brittany had given up in their eagerness to be rid of me. That night, I slept better than I had since Bob's funeral. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since the reading of the will, I felt like I was moving toward something instead of running away from everything I'd lost. The phone in my bedroom buzzed once with another text from Jake, but I didn't even look at it. Whatever crisis was driving him to reach out could wait. I had more important things to focus on now. Outside my window, the old windmill creaked in the night breeze, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like a promise. The basement had always intimidated me. Every time I'd visited the ranch over the years, Bob had steered me away from those narrow wooden stairs that disappeared into darkness below the kitchen. "Nothing down there but junk and spiders," he'd always said with that dismissive wave of his hand. "Not worth bothering with." But after finding the mining documents upstairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that Bob had been protecting more than just my fear of cobwebs. So, on a gray Thursday morning, armed with a heavy flashlight and more determination than common sense, I finally descended into the basement of the ranch house. The stairs groaned under my weight, and the musty smell of earth and old wood filled my nostrils. The flashlight beam revealed stone foundation walls that looked much older than the house above them, massive blocks fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized the basement was larger than I'd expected, extending well beyond the footprint of the house above. Along one wall stood a workbench covered with tools I didn't recognize at first glance. There were picks and hammers, but also strange measuring devices that looked like they belonged in a museum. Everything was arranged with careful precision, as if someone had been using this space for serious work rather than storage. But it was the far corner that made my breath catch in my throat. There, partially hidden behind stacks of wooden crates, was what looked unmistakably like the entrance to a tunnel. My heart pounded as I approached it, the flashlight beam dancing ahead of me like a nervous animal. The opening was about 4 feet high, shored up with timber that looked sturdy despite its obvious age. A cool draft flowed from the darkness beyond, carrying a mineral scent that reminded me of the geology samples I'd found upstairs. This wasn't some natural cave or root cellar. Someone had dug this deliberately, and from the professional look of the support beams, they'd known exactly what they were doing. I wasn't brave enough to venture into that tunnel alone, but I could see enough to know it extended well into the earth beneath the ranch. The walls were smooth, carved with the kind of precision that spoke to serious engineering knowledge. This was the work of someone who understood mining, not the amateur digging of a hopeful prospector. Turning back to explore the rest of the basement, I began examining the wooden crates more carefully. Most were empty, filled with nothing but mouse droppings and cobwebs. But one in the corner felt different when I tried to move it. Heavier, more substantial. inside, wrapped in layers of canvas that had protected them from decades of moisture. I found chunks of rock that definitely didn't belong in someone's casual collection. Even with my limited knowledge of geology, I could see veins of green and blue running through the gray stone like rivers of color. The rocks felt substantial in my hands, and when I scratched one with a nail file from my purse, it left a metallic streak that caught the flashlight beam. Copper. I was almost certain of it. These weren't just random samples, they were evidence of active mining, proof that someone had been extracting valuable ore from beneath this property. But the real treasure was in the last crate I opened. At the bottom, beneath more rock samples and what looked like old mining equipment, I found a leather portfolio tied with string. My hands trembled as I untied the knots and opened it to reveal documents that made everything I'd found upstairs look like rough drafts. These were official geological surveys completed just 5 years ago by a professional mining company. The letterhead read, Morrison Geological Associates, and the reports were addressed to T. Williams.
Apparently Bob had commissioned this work under his grandfather's name to avoid attracting local attention. The technical language was challenging, but the conclusions were crystal clear. The property contained what the geologists called a significant copper deposit with excellent commercial potential. There were estimates of ore quality, extraction costs, and projected revenues that made my hands shake as I read them. One document was particularly eye-opening, a feasibility study that outlined how modern mining techniques could extract the copper with minimal environmental impact. The technology had advanced significantly since Tom's time, making extraction both more efficient and more profitable. The projected revenue over a 20-year lease was astronomical, enough to make someone wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But the document that changed everything was dated just 3 months before Bob's death.
It was a formal offer from Southwestern Mining Corporation to lease the mineral rights for an upfront payment of $2 million, plus quarterly royalties that could total millions more over the life of the lease. $2 million. I read the number 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Bob had received an offer that would have solved every financial problem we'd ever had, that would have secured our retirement and Jake's future, and he'd never even told me about it. I sat on an overturned crate surrounded by evidence of my husband's secret life and tried to process what this meant. For years, while I'd worried about retirement savings and medical bills, while I'd watched Jake struggle with his mortgage and Brittany complain about wanting a bigger house, we'd been sitting on a fortune that could have changed everything. More than that, Bob had known about it. He'd commissioned surveys, received formal offers, and kept it all hidden from everyone, including me. Why? What had he been planning? Why maintain such an enormous secret even from his own wife? I found part of the answer in the very last document in the portfolio. It was a handwritten note in Bob's familiar script, dated just weeks before his final hospital stay. The words were shaky, written by a man who knew his time was running out. Dorothy deserves better than what I gave her. This is her chance to have the life she sacrificed for Jake and me. Don't let that woman ruin everything we worked for. That woman, even facing death. Bob couldn't bring himself to write Brittany's name, but his meaning was unmistakably clear. He'd known exactly what kind of person his daughter-in-law was, and he'd been protecting this discovery from her influence. He'd watched her manipulate Jake, seen how she treated me, and decided that this secret would be his final gift to the wife who'd given up everything for their family. The ranch that Jake and Brittany had dismissed as worthless, that they'd used to exile me from the family, was worth more than everything else in Bob's estate combined. In their eagerness to claim the valuable assets and get rid of the inconvenient mother, they'd essentially handed me millions of dollars while congratulating themselves on their cleverness. I climbed the basement stairs with my mind reeling and my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and vindication. In the kitchen, I spread all the documents across the table. Tom's original surveys, Bob's research, the mining company's offers. and tried to absorb the full magnitude of what I'd discovered. For the first time since Bob's death, since Jake's betrayal, since Brittany's cruel dismissal, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: power. Real power. Not the temporary authority of making dinner or managing household finances, but the kind of power that comes from having options and resources that other people desperately want. I thought about Jake and Brittany in their perfect suburban house, counting the money from Bob's estate and planning their renovations. They thought they'd gotten rid of me, shuffled me off to somewhere I couldn't interfere with their plans or remind them of their obligations to family. Instead, they'd handed me the keys to a kingdom they didn't even know existed. The irony was so perfect it almost felt fictional. They'd worked so hard to exclude me from their inheritance. And in doing so, they'd given me the most valuable part of it. Bob's final act of love hadn't been the will they'd heard read in the lawyer's office. It had been his decision to leave me the one piece of property that could transform my life completely. I picked up my phone and looked at the number for Southwestern Mining Corporation. One call would change everything. One conversation would transform me from a discarded widow living on Social Security into a woman with the kind of wealth that commanded respect and attention. But I didn't call immediately. Instead, I sat in the growing darkness of the kitchen and savored the feeling of holding all the cards for once in my life. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of claiming my inheritance. Tomorrow, I would start building a new life on my own terms. Tonight, I would simply enjoy knowing that Dorothy Williams, the woman Jake and Brittany had dismissed as irrelevant and useless, was about to become more powerful than either of them had ever imagined. The transformation had begun, and I was the only one who knew it. The men from Southwestern Mining Corporation arrived on Tuesday morning in a white pickup truck that looked both serious and expensive. I'd spent the weekend preparing for this meeting, researching everything I could about mineral rights and mining leases. I'd also driven into town and bought myself a new outfit, not the practical clothes I'd worn for years while caring for Bob, but a sharp business suit that made me feel like someone worth taking seriously. The team leader, Mike Rodriguez, had the kind of calm competence that comes from decades of experience in the field. His weathered face and steady handshake spoke of a man who'd spent his career evaluating land and making decisions worth millions of dollars. His assistant, Amanda Parker, carried a tablet and several pieces of equipment I didn't recognize, but her confident manner suggested she knew exactly how to use them. "Mrs. Williams," Mike said, shaking my hand with genuine respect. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your husband was a smart man to hold on to this property for so long." We spent the morning walking the boundaries of the ranch while Mike explained what they'd found in their previous surveys. He pointed out geological features I'd never noticed, rock formations that indicated mineral deposits, subtle changes in soil color that spoke to what lay beneath the surface. As we walked, I began to see the land differently, not as the barren exile I'd initially thought, but as something valuable and full of potential. "The copper seam runs diagonally across your property," Amanda explained, showing me a digital map on her tablet. "It's what we call a high-grade deposit, which means the concentration of metal is well above average. That translates to significantly higher royalty payments for you." When we reached the area above the basement tunnel, Mike stopped and smiled with obvious appreciation. "Your husband's grandfather was no fool. This tunnel follows the copper vein almost perfectly. He must have had excellent instincts about geology, or maybe he had help from someone who understood the local formations." "What kind of money are we talking about?" I asked, surprising myself with how businesslike I sounded. Mike and Amanda exchanged a look that suggested they'd discussed this question in advance. "Mrs. Williams," Mike said carefully, "given current copper prices and what we know about your deposit, we're prepared to offer you $4 million up front for a 20-year lease, plus quarterly royalties that should average between $300,000 and $500,000. I managed to keep my expression neutral, but inside, I was reeling. $4 million up front. $500,000 every 3 months. In the first year alone, I'd make more money than Bob and I had earned in our entire marriage combined. "I'll need to review the contract with a lawyer," I said, proud of how steady my voice remained. "Of course," Mike replied with obvious respect. "Take all the time you need. But Mrs. Williams, I want you to know this is an exceptional property. Your husband could have made this deal years ago and lived very comfortably. I'm curious why he waited." I thought about Bob's handwritten note, about his reference to protecting me from that woman. I thought about his knowledge of Brittany's character and his determination to keep this discovery from her grasping hands. "I think he was waiting for the right time," I said simply. That afternoon, after Mike and Amanda left with promises to have contracts ready within the week, I sat in the ranch house kitchen staring at the preliminary agreement they'd given me. The numbers seemed almost fictional, more money than I'd ever dreamed of having. Enough to secure not just my future, but to completely redefine what my life could become. But more than the money, I felt something else stirring in my chest, a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced in decades. For 42 years, I'd defined myself by what I could do for other people. I was Jake's mother, Bob's wife, the grandmother who sent birthday cards and Christmas presents. My own dreams had been set aside so long ago, I'd almost forgotten what they were. Now, suddenly, I had the power to define myself however I wanted. I could travel, learn new things, support causes I believed in, or simply live comfortably without worrying about every dollar. For the first time in my adult life, I would have choices that were truly my own. My phone rang. Interrupting my thoughts, the caller ID showed Jake's number. For the first time in weeks, I decided to answer. "Mom." His voice sounded strained, uncertain. "I've been trying to reach you for days." "I've been busy," I said simply, not elaborating. There was a pause, and I could hear him struggling with what to say next. "Look, Mom, Brittany thinks maybe we were too harsh at the lawyer's office. She wanted me to call and see how you're settling in." Brittany wanted him to call, not Jake himself. Even now, he couldn't have a conversation with his own mother without his wife's permission. "I'm settling in just fine," I said. "Good. That's good." Another pause, longer this time. "The thing is, Mom, we're having some cash flow issues with the house. The property taxes are higher than we expected, and Brittany wants to renovate the kitchen. We were wondering if you might be able to help us out, just temporarily." There it was. They'd barely finished counting the money from Bob's estate, and already they needed more. I thought about the contract sitting on my kitchen table, about the millions of dollars I'd soon have access to. "How much?" I asked. "Well, the taxes are about $12,000, and the kitchen renovation would be around $30,000, so maybe $50,000 total. We'd pay you back as soon as we can refinance." $50,000. 6 months ago. That would have been an impossible sum for me to imagine having. Now it was less than what I'd earn in quarterly royalties from the mining lease. "Jake," I said slowly, "are you happy with Brittany?" The question clearly caught him off guard. "What?" "Of course I'm happy. Why would you ask that?" "Because in 42 years of marriage, your father never once asked me to lie for him, never made me choose between him and my family, and never made me feel ashamed of where I came from." Silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Jake said quietly, "Mom, what are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that a good partner makes you better, not smaller. They don't isolate you from the people who love you or make you feel guilty for caring about your family." "Brittany doesn't isolate me. She has high standards." "High standards. as if treating his mother with basic human decency was some kind of unreasonable expectation. 3 days later, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. Jake's voice was panicked, desperate in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child. "Mom, thank God you answered. Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours." "I've been taking care of business," I said calmly, though my heart was racing with anticipation. "What seems to be the problem?" "The problem," his voice cracked with stress. "Mom, we got a notice from the county yesterday. They're saying Dad never properly transferred the mineral rights to our house when he bought the lot from his grandfather's estate. They're saying those rights might still belong to the ranch property." I took a slow sip of my morning coffee, savoring both the taste and the moment. "Is that so? Mom, this is serious. If they're right, it could affect our property value significantly. The bank is asking questions about our loan. We might have to refinance at a much higher interest rate." Of course they would. I'd discovered this particular detail while reviewing the mining company's geological surveys. When Tom Williams had divided the original ranch property in the 1960s, selling off small parcels including the lot where Jake's house now stood, the mineral rights had remained with the main ranch property. It was a common practice in that era and completely legal. The irony was exquisite. Jake and Brittany had the house and all of Bob's liquid assets, but I owned everything valuable underneath their property. Every dollar of copper, silver, or any other mineral beneath their perfect suburban lawn legally belonged to me. "Have you talked to a lawyer?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "That's what we're trying to do, but attorneys are expensive, Mom, really expensive. And with the refinancing issues..." His voice trailed off helplessly. "How expensive?" The initial consultation alone was $5,000. A full property rights review could cost $30,000 or $40,000. Money we don't have right now, especially if we have to refinance the house at a higher rate. I let the silence stretch out, listening to Jake's anxious breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, I said, "Well, that is quite a problem. Mom, please." The desperation in his voice was almost painful to hear. "I know things have been difficult between us lately, but we're family. We need to stick together." Family. There was that word again, appearing like magic whenever they needed something from me. "Jake, do you remember what Brittany said to me at the lawyer's office?" "Mom, she was upset. We all were. People say things when they're grieving. She told me to get out of your lives and go play farmer. She said I'd failed as a mother. She said maybe the isolation would give me time to think about my failures." She didn't mean it like that. How did she mean it? Jake? Because it sounded pretty clear to me. Another pause. Longer this time. When Jake spoke again, his voice was small, like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Mom, what do you want?" "An apology." "Fine. I'm sorry. Brittany's sorry too. We all handled Dad's death badly." An apology? As if 40 years of sacrifice and unconditional love could be balanced by a grudging sorry delivered under financial duress. "Jake, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Okay. "I've signed a mining lease for the ranch property, a very lucrative mining lease." Silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "What kind of mining lease? The kind that's going to make me more money in the next year than your father and I earned in our entire marriage." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Jake found his voice. "How much money?" "Mom, enough that I don't need to worry about attorney fees or refinancing or property taxes ever again." "Jesus Christ." His voice was hollow, shocked. "How long have you known about this?" "I found out after I moved to the ranch,
After you and Brittany made it very clear that I wasn't welcome in your new life. Mom, we never said you weren't welcome. You didn't have to say it, Jake. Actions speak louder than words, and your actions told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in your priorities. I could hear Brittany's voice in the background, shrill and demanding. Jake covered the phone, but I could still make out fragments. How much? Millions. Get her to. When Jake came back on the line, his voice had changed.
It was the tone he used to use when he wanted something as a child, wheedling, manipulative, calculated to trigger my maternal instincts. Mom, I know we've made mistakes, but we're family. Whatever's happening with this mining thing, we should face it together. Maybe we can work something out that benefits everyone. Benefits everyone. Translation, give us money. What kind of arrangement did you have in mind? I asked. Well, if the mineral rights thing affects our property, maybe we could merge the properties back together, pool our resources. We could all live comfortably. Pool our resources, after they'd worked so hard to exile me from their comfortable life. Where would I live in this arrangement? I asked. With us. Of course, we could build you a nice apartment over the garage. You'd have your privacy, but you'd be close to the grandkids. An apartment over the garage. After I'd just become worth millions of dollars, they were offering me an apartment over the garage. Jake, I said, my voice deadly calm, let me make sure I understand this correctly. 3 weeks ago, your wife told me to get out of your lives and rot in isolation at a worthless ranch. Now that you've discovered that ranch is worth a fortune, you want to pool resources and graciously allow me to live over your garage. Is that an accurate summary? Mom, when you put it like that, it sounds exactly like what it is. You want my money, but you still don't want me. That's not true. Isn't it? Tell me, Jake, in this wonderful arrangement you're proposing, who would control the mining lease? Who would make the financial decisions? Who would determine how the money gets spent? Silence. I thought so. My phone buzzed with another incoming call. Brittany, calling from her own phone. I ignored it. Mom, please don't do anything hasty. Let's sit down and talk about this like adults. I am being an adult. Jake, for the first time in 40 years, I'm making decisions based on what's best for me, not what's convenient for other people. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm done being your safety net. I'm done being the person you call when you need money or free babysitting or someone to blame for your problems. I'm done being expendable. You're not expendable. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Grief can make people do irrational things. Irrational. Now I was irrational for refusing to bail them out of a crisis of their own making. Jake, the next time you speak to me, I want it to be because you actually want a relationship with me, not because you want something from me. Until then, I suggest you figure out how to solve your own problems. I hung up before he could respond. Within seconds, my phone was buzzing again. Jake, then Brittany, then Jake again. I turned it off and set it aside. Outside, the sun was setting over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow, representatives from the mining company would arrive to begin the preliminary survey work. Soon, this quiet property would be bustling with activity as they prepared to extract the wealth that had been sleeping beneath the earth for millions of years. But tonight, it was just me and the silence and the knowledge that everything had changed. I wasn't the woman who'd been exiled from her own family anymore. I wasn't the convenient source of emergency funds or free labor or guilt-absorbing apologies. I was Dorothy Williams, and I was worth exactly what I said I was worth. Nothing more, and definitely nothing less. My phone, even though it was turned off, seemed to pulse with the weight of all those missed calls. 62 attempts to reach me in a single day. Not because they'd suddenly realized they loved me, but because they'd finally realized what they'd thrown away. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. I was sitting on the porch of my renovated ranch house, watching the sunrise paint the mountains purple and gold, when the mining company's quarterly report arrived. The envelope felt substantial in my hands, thick with official documents and financial statements that had become the new rhythm of my life. Inside, along with the usual technical updates about extraction progress and market prices, was a check that still made my breath catch, even though I'd received 3 of them now. $437,000, my share of the copper sales for the previous quarter. I set the check aside and picked up my coffee, savoring the ritual that had become precious to me. Every morning I sat on this porch and watched the world wake up around me. Some days I saw deer grazing in the distance, their movements graceful and unhurried. Other days I watched the mining crews arrive for their shift, respectful and efficient in their work on the far side of the property where the main extraction was taking place. The ranch house itself had been completely transformed. I'd used some of the initial payment to renovate it properly, preserving its character while adding modern conveniences. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, providing clean energy for the new kitchen with its efficient appliances, the central heating and air conditioning system, and the high-speed internet that allowed me to manage my investments and stay connected to the world. But more than the physical improvements, I'd invested in experiences that had been impossible during my years of financial struggle. I'd taken a photography class and discovered I had an eye for capturing the beauty of the landscape around me. I'd traveled to Santa Fe and spent a week learning about the Native American culture that had shaped this region's history. I'd even enrolled in a geology course at the community college, wanting to understand the science behind the wealth flowing from my land. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself, pursuing interests that had nothing to do with caring for other people or managing their needs. It was both liberating and slightly terrifying, this business of being responsible only for my own happiness. The phone beside me rang once and stopped, someone leaving a voicemail. I didn't rush to check it anymore. These days, most of my calls were from people I actually wanted to talk to. Victoria Hayes, my attorney, keeping me updated on legal matters. Mike Rodriguez from the mining company providing operational updates. Amanda Parker, who'd become something of a friend as well as a professional contact, and sometimes, though less frequently now, calls from Jake. The character of his communications had changed dramatically over the past 6 months. The desperate pleading of those first weeks had gradually given way to awkward attempts at normal conversation. Last week, he'd called to tell me that his youngest daughter, Emma, had made the honor roll. The week before, he'd asked for my pot roast recipe, the one his grandmother had taught me when he was small. Small gestures, but they felt different from his previous communication. Less calculated, more genuine. I'd started answering about half of his calls, testing the waters of what a real relationship between us might look like. Brittany, on the other hand, had stopped calling entirely after a particularly unpleasant conversation in February. She'd accused me of manipulating the situation and turning Jake against his own family, her voice shrill with the kind of desperation that comes from watching carefully laid plans fall apart. I'd listened to her rant for about 2 minutes before calmly informing her that I had neither the time nor the inclination to manipulate anyone, and that if Jake was reconsidering his priorities, perhaps she should examine her own behavior instead of blaming me. She'd hung up on me mid-sentence. It was the last time we'd spoken. From what Jake told me during our careful conversations, their marriage was struggling under the weight of financial stress and mutual recrimination. The mineral rights issue had forced them to refinance their house at a punitive interest rate. Brittany's grand renovation plans had been shelved indefinitely, replaced by arguments about money and blame. Most tellingly, Jake had started attending family therapy sessions, alone,
since Brittany refused to participate in anything that might suggest she bore responsibility for their problems.
"I'm learning about boundaries," he'd told me during our last conversation. About the difference between supporting someone and enabling them. I'd said nothing in response. But the irony wasn't lost on me. Jake was learning lessons I'd tried to teach him for years, but only after watching his own world crumble under the weight of his wife's impossible demands and his own inability to stand up for what was right. The voicemail light was blinking on my phone when I finally checked it an hour later. I picked up the device and played the message, curious about who had called so early in the morning. "Hi, Mom." Jake's voice was softer than it used to be, less demanding and more tentative. "I wanted to let you know that Emma made the honor roll this semester, and Tommy's soccer team made it to the regional finals. I thought you might want to know." A pause, and I could hear him struggling with what to say next. "I also wanted to say that I've been thinking about what you said about being the man you raised me to be. I'm trying. Mom, it's harder than I thought it would be, but I'm really trying." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the weight of everything that had happened between us. "I love you, Mom. I know I haven't said that enough lately, or shown it the way I should have, but I do. And I'm sorry for everything, not just the money stuff, but for letting Brittany treat you the way she did, for not standing up for you when you needed me to. I'm sorry for being the kind of son who made you feel like you had to choose between having dignity and having a family." The message ended with a soft click, leaving me sitting in the morning stillness with tears streaming down my face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of hope, of the possibility that something real might be salvaged from the wreckage of our relationship. I scrolled through my contacts and called him back without hesitation. "Mom?" He sounded surprised, hopeful. "I didn't expect you to call back so quickly." "I got your message," I said simply. "Tell me about Emma's honor roll." For the next 20 minutes, we talked about his children in a way we hadn't in years. Jake told me about Emma's passion for science, how she'd been conducting experiments in their garage and talking about studying geology in college. He mentioned Tommy's soccer skills and his dream of playing in high school, maybe even earning a scholarship someday. He talked about their struggles and triumphs, their personalities and quirks, with the kind of detailed affection that reminded me of the young father he'd once been. Before Brittany had convinced him that sharing his children with their grandmother was somehow a sign of weakness or failure. "They miss you," he said simply. "They ask about their grandmother all the time, wondering when they might see you again." "I miss them too," I admitted, surprised by how much I meant it. "Would you like to bring them for a visit sometime? The ranch is quite comfortable now, and there's plenty of space for them to explore." "Really? You'd want that?" "Jake, I never stopped wanting to be part of their lives. I just wasn't willing to accept being treated as disposable anymore." "I understand," he said, and I could hear that he truly meant it. "And Mom, about Brittany and me, we're separated right now. Have been for about a month." I wasn't surprised by the news, but I was careful not to sound pleased about it. "I'm sorry to hear that your marriage didn't work out the way you hoped." "Are you sorry? I mean," I considered the question carefully. "I'm sorry that your marriage didn't work out the way you hoped it would. I'm not sorry that you're finally putting your own needs and your children's needs first." "She said I'd have to choose between her and you," Jake said quietly, and I told her that anyone who would make me choose between the people I love doesn't understand what love actually means. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. "I'm proud of you," I said, and meant it completely. "Can I ask you something, Mom?" "Of course." "When you found out about the mining thing, about how much money it was worth, did you ever think about sharing it with us, even after everything that happened?" I considered the question carefully, wanting to give him an honest answer, rather than one designed to make him feel better. Do you want the complete truth? Yes. For about 5 minutes, I thought about using the money to solve everyone's problems. Pay off your mortgage, set up college funds for the kids, make everything smooth and easy again. What changed your mind? I realized that fixing your problems wouldn't actually help you learn anything. It would just enable you to keep making the same mistakes. Sometimes people need to face consequences before they can understand how to make better choices. Silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding, of two people finally hearing each other clearly. "I'm learning that now," Jake said finally. "The hard way. But I'm learning it." "Good," I said. "That's how the best lessons usually come." We talked for a few more minutes about practical things, when he might visit with the children, whether he needed help finding a family therapist who specialized in divorce mediation, how he was managing as a single father working full-time while trying to rebuild his relationship with his kids. After we hung up, I sat on my porch and watched the sun climb higher into the cloudless sky. The mining equipment hummed in the distance, a steady reminder of the wealth flowing from the earth beneath my feet. But the real treasure wasn't in the quarterly checks or the renovated house or the financial security I'd never imagined possible. The real treasure was in reclaiming my own worth, in learning that love without respect was just manipulation with a prettier name, in discovering that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to face their own consequences and grow from them. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Amanda Parker, sending photos from a geology conference where she'd presented our site as a case study in successful small-scale copper extraction. "Your property is famous in geology circles now," she'd written. "The woman who struck it rich at 69. I smiled and texted back, "Copper, not gold, but close enough." Epilogue. The new beginning. As I prepared to go inside and start my day, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back at me was still 69 years old, still a widow, still learning to navigate a world that often dismissed people like her. But she was also a woman who'd discovered that it's never too late to reclaim your power, never too late to set boundaries that protect your dignity, and never too late to learn that your worth isn't determined by how useful you are to other people, but by how true you are to yourself. The phone rang again. This time it was Mike Rodriguez with an update on next quarter's projections and news that other mining companies were expressing interest in adjacent properties, drawn by the success of our operation. As I listened to him explain the latest market trends and extraction rates, I found myself thinking about Bob and his grandfather Tom, and all the generations of people who'd made sacrifices and compromises and settled for less than they deserved. That cycle ended with me. I was no longer someone's convenient fallback plan or emergency fund or repository for guilt and disappointment. I was Dorothy Williams, owner of one of the most productive copper mines in the state, grandmother to children who would grow up knowing that love means respect, and a woman who'd finally learned the difference between being needed and being valued. The transformation was complete, and it had happened exactly as it should have. Quietly, with dignity, and entirely on my own terms. Outside. The windmill continued its steady rhythm, no longer sounding like loneliness, but like a promise of all the mornings yet to come. I had work to do, places to see, relationships to rebuild, and a life to live on my own terms. For the first time in decades, the future felt like something I was writing rather than something that was happening to me. And that, I realized, was worth more than all the copper in New Mexico.